The kettle on my stove is a squat enamel thing, robin's egg blue, and it has a way of ticking as it cools that sounds like a small clock counting down to nothing in particular. This morning I made coffee the slow way, the way my mother taught me, pouring the water in 3 thin circles over the grounds and waiting between each one. And Grant sat across the kitchen table from me in a sweater I bought him 4 Christmases ago, watching me do it with the careful, borrowed patience of a man who has learned, at 51, that he no longer gets to hurry me. The house is quiet in the particular way a house gets quiet when the shouting is long over and something has settled into the floorboards for good. I slid a cup toward him, and he thanked me, and there was a time when that would have felt like a victory, and now it just felt like Tuesday. That is what I have on the other side of all of it, and I want you to understand exactly what it cost to buy that morning. Because there is one image I keep going back to, and it isn't the bank, and it isn't the moment his face came apart. It is the kitchen of our old house on Bellamont Street last April, and a manila envelope on the counter with my name misspelled on the front in his mother's slanted hand. Violette, with an extra letter, the way she'd been misspelling it on purpose for 11 years. And inside it, a receipt for a truck I had never agreed to buy, printed on the pale blue paper the dealership used, folded once, still smelling faintly of the peppermints Ruth kept in her purse. That envelope is the seed of everything. But to understand this cup of coffee, and the man drinking it, and the enamel kettle ticking behind me, you have to know what happened last spring. And to know that, you have to know who I was before Grant Ingram ever learned my name. I grew up the third of 4 children in Gallipolis, Ohio, a river town of about 3,000 people, where the Ohio bends wide and brown, and the barges go by all night, pushing coal downriver toward Huntington. My father drove a delivery route for a bakery in Point Pleasant across the bridge, and my mother cleaned rooms at the Holiday Inn out by the highway and took in mending on the side. And between the 2 of them, they made just enough that we never quite believed we were poor, which is its own kind of wealth. My mother's name was Della, and she had a saying she used so often that my brothers and I could mouth it along with her. Money leaves the room, she'd tell us, but the way you treated people stays sitting in the chair. I did not understand that sentence for most of my life. I understand it now more than I want to. What I had growing up was a stubbornness that the nuns at Sacred Heart called willful, and my mother called useful, and a habit of watching people closely enough to know what they needed before they said it. That habit is why I became a nurse. I worked the front desk at a physical therapy office in Huntington for 2 years after high school, saving, and then I did my associates at the community college nights while working days. And then, at 29, older than everyone in my cohort, I finished my nurse practitioner program at Marshall and cried in the parking lot of the pharmacy afterward because my mother had died 4 months before she could see it. I put myself through every step of that with no help from anyone, and I mention it not for sympathy, but because it matters later how much I already knew about standing on my own before anyone told me I couldn't. I met Grant Ingram in the spring of 2011 at a fundraiser for the Free Clinic, where he was pouring wine at a folding table because his construction firm had donated the lumber for the new wing. He was tall and easy in his body, and he laughed like he meant it. And when I told him I was a nurse practitioner, he asked me 3 questions in a row that showed he'd actually listened to the answers, which, if you have ever been a woman at a fundraiser, you know is rarer than it should be. He drove a work truck that smelled of sawdust, and he had a way of resting his hand on the small of my back that felt like being steered gently by someone who knew where the good part of the evening was. I was 34. I had told myself I was done waiting for anyone, and then there he was, and I let myself stop being done. We married in the fall of 2012 at a lodge above the river with 60 guests, and for a long stretch of years it was genuinely good. And I need you to believe that part, because the ending only weighs what it weighs if the beginning was real. We bought the house on Bellamont, a 1954 brick ranch with a walnut tree in the back that dropped its hulls all over the yard every October and stained our hands black when we cleaned them up together, laughing. He built me a window seat in the front room with his own hands and a bookcase to match, and I still have the bookcase. It's in the hall of the new place now. Those were the years I thought I knew what loyalty was. I thought it was a thing you decided once and then simply kept, like a promise filed away in a drawer. And I did not yet understand that loyalty is a thing that gets tested over and over, small ways and large, and that the whole meaning of a person is in whether they stay or run when the test comes. The cooling came the way the river ices, not all at once, but from the edges in, so slowly that you could stand on it a while before you noticed it wouldn't hold you. The first crack I can point to was his mother. Ruth Ingram was 71 when I married her son, a small, sharp woman who had raised 3 boys alone after her husband walked out in 1979. And I understood early that in her mind, love was a finite quantity, a single pie, and every slice Grant gave to me was a slice taken from her plate. She corrected the way I set a table. She asked me, in front of company, whether nursing was really the same as being a doctor, or just close to it. And she began, around our 5th year, to arrive on Sunday afternoons unannounced and to stay through supper. And Grant, who as a boy had learned that the quickest road to peace was down whichever path his mother pointed, began to defer to her in 100 small domestic things, until I felt like a guest in the house I had helped pay for. There was a night in the winter of 2019 that I returned to often. We had Ruth and Grant's younger brother Marcus over for Marcus's birthday, and I had made a standing rib roast. And somewhere between the roast and the cake, Ruth started in on how I worked too much. How a wife who was never home was how a marriage got hollow. I watched my husband's face across the table, waiting for him to say the thing any decent man says, which is that his wife's work had paid for half the house we were sitting in. He didn't say it. He looked at his plate, and he cut his meat, and he let his mother finish. And Marcus, who was 38 and drove for a propane company and had never in his life managed to hold on to $1 or a job for long, laughed along. And I sat there with a mouthful of roast I couldn't swallow and understood that I was, in that room, alone. I want to be careful about Marcus because he matters. He was not cruel the way Ruth was cruel. He was weak the way water is weak, taking the shape of whatever held him, and what held him was his mother. He borrowed money from Grant twice that I know of and never paid it back, and each time Ruth framed it as family taking care of family, and each time the money was money I had earned, though no one said so out loud. By 2022, I had stopped keeping the household accounts joint in my head, even when they were joint on paper. I had a separate account at Kanawha Valley Federal that I fed quietly, and I told myself it was just prudence, just a nurse's habit of keeping a supply closet stocked. And I did not yet admit to myself what I was really doing, which was building a shore to stand on. The last erosion scene, the one that set up everything after, happened at the office. There was a woman named Courtney Delp who did billing at the medical group where I worked, 29, glossy, and quick, and she had taken up with Grant's firm as a part-time bookkeeper on the side. And by the spring of 2023, she was texting my husband things that a bookkeeper does not text a client. And I knew because Grant left his phone face up on the window seat one evening, and I am not a saint. I did not confront him. I sat with it. I have found that the loudest thing you can do to a certain kind of man is to go very quiet and let him wonder. And Grant was that kind of man, though it would take him a long time to notice the quiet had a shape and a purpose to it. Now I have to tell you about the bonus and about the truck, because that is the offense, the thing the envelope on the counter carried. And it landed in April of last year with a weight that surprised even me. I need to explain the money plainly first, the way I'd explain a diagnosis to a patient, because the whole thing turns on it. 6 years earlier, in 2018, I had done a favor for a friend from my Marshall days named Dev Anand, who was building a small medical scheduling software company called Ashgrove Partners out of an office park in Columbus. The favor was that I let him borrow $12,000 of my careful savings and, more valuable, my clinical knowledge of how a practice actually runs. In exchange, he gave me a slice of the company on paper that I frankly forgot about for years. In the winter of 2023, a hospital network in Cincinnati bought Ashgrove Partners, and my slice of paper turned into a wire transfer, and the plain sentence, the one you need to hold, is this: I was, quietly and to no one's knowledge but my attorney's, worth a little over $4 million. Nobody in my house knew. Not Grant, not Ruth, not Courtney Delp. I had told exactly one person, and I'll get to her. So there was the bonus. It was smaller, and it was mine in a different way. A retention bonus of $18,000 the medical group paid me in March for signing a 3-year commitment. And it went, by an old automatic instruction neither of us had ever changed, into the joint account at Kanawha Valley Federal. I noticed it land. I planned to move it to the roof, which needed $12,000 in repairs, and to the rest of the walnut money. And I told Grant so over dinner, and he nodded, and he said nothing. And 11 days later, I found the pale blue receipt in the envelope his mother had left on the counter, with my name misspelled. He had taken it. All of it. And $4,000 more from the household reserve. And he had bought his brother Marcus a used 2021 Ram 1500 with a crew cab, and he had done it without a single word to me. This is the part that still, months later, sits in my chest like a swallowed stone. His mother had decided that Marcus needed it more than a roof needed fixing, and Grant had never once in 30 years learned to tell that woman no. And somewhere along the way, he had come to believe that my money was simply Ingram money that happened to arrive by my hand. When I found the receipt, Grant was in the garage, and Ruth was on the phone in the other room. And I stood in the kitchen holding that pale blue paper, and I did not raise my voice. I have been asked since whether I broke down, and the truth is stranger and colder than that. Something in me stepped back from the edge of feeling entirely, and stood at a small distance, the way you learn to do in a trauma bay when a child comes in and you have 30 seconds to be useful before you can afford to be a person again. My pulse actually slowed. I remember hearing the refrigerator hum and thinking, with a clarity that almost frightened me, that I had spent 11 years mistaking a man's ease for kindness and his mother's control for family, and that the mistake was over now, and that I was not going to spend one more evening explaining to either of them why what they'd done was wrong, because people who need that explained will only use it to argue. I put the receipt in my pocket, I made supper, and I began that night to think in a way I had never let myself think before, which was to think about how this would end. That was the turn. Not loud, just a door closing somewhere in me that I did not intend to open again. I called Harriet Boyd the next morning. Harriet was the one person I'd told about the Ashgrove money. 63 years old, an estate and family law attorney out of Point Pleasant, with a gravel voice and a law office in a converted dry goods store on Main. She had handled the paperwork on the wire transfer the winter before, and she had said to me then, over the top of her reading glasses, that a woman with $4 million and a husband who didn't know it was a woman holding a lit match in a dry field, and that I should decide what I wanted to burn or put it out. I hadn't been ready to decide. I was ready now. Harriet did not tell me to leave. That is the first thing I loved her for. She told me to gather. She said that in her 40 years of practice, she had watched 100 women lose the argument by having it too early, and that the only real power a person holds is the power they hold quietly until the moment it can't be taken back. She had me pull 3 years of statements from Kanawha Valley Federal. She had me document the automatic bonus deposit and the withdrawal and the truck purchase, and she had me get the VIN and the dealership paperwork. All of it. A clean paper trail showing that $18,000 of clearly labeled retention bonus plus $4,000 more had left our account and become a truck titled to Marcus Ingram without my signature anywhere on anything. On its own, that was a marital property mess, not a weapon. What made it a weapon was what came next. And what came next, I have to be honest, they did to themselves. Because Grant and Ruth were not content to have simply taken from me, they needed, in the weeks after, to make it my fault. And this is the thing about a certain kind of arrogance. It cannot leave a wound alone. It has to press on it to prove it doesn't matter. In May, Grant announced that we should refinance the house to pull out cash for the firm, which had a slow spring. And I said no, calmly, because it was half my house, and I did not choose to hand my equity to a man who'd just proven what he did with my money. Ruth began telling people at Sacred Heart that I was hiding money from my own husband, that I had a secret account, that I was cold and calculating and had never really been family. She was closer to the truth than she knew, and further from it than she could imagine, both at once. And then, in June, they made the move that ended them, and I still don't fully know whose idea it was, though I have suspicions that begin with the letter R. I keep our safe deposit box at the main branch of Riverbend Trust, downtown, in the old bank building on 2nd Avenue with the marble floor and the brass teller cages they kept for decoration when they renovated in the 90s. In that box, I kept the Ashgrove paperwork, my mother's wedding ring, the deed to the Bellamont house, and about $9,000 in cash I'd set aside over years. Grant was a co-signer on the box. We'd set it up together in 2014, and I'd never thought to change it because changing it would have said out loud the thing I wasn't ready to say. In the last week of June, Grant went into that box alone, and he took photographs, and he removed a single document, a copy of a promissory note from the old Ashgrove loan, the one that showed I'd put $12,000 into Dev's company in 2018. And he took it to a lawyer of his own, a slick man named Petey Cobb, who did wills and DUIs out by the courthouse. And together, I later learned, they began to build a story. The story was this: that I had for years been secretly moving marital money into a company without disclosure, that I had hidden hundreds of thousands from the marriage, that I was the deceiver and the thief, and that when the divorce came, and Grant had by then decided to file first, on his mother's advice, to get ahead of me, he would arrive at the settlement table with proof that his cold, secretive wife had been robbing the family for years. And here is the piece that turned a nasty divorce into a reckoning. They didn't have the proof, so Petey Cobb suggested they make some. Grant went back into that safe deposit box a second time in the first week of July, and he planted a document, a forged loan schedule showing amounts I'd never touched, dates I could disprove, a fabrication meant to be discovered and used to paint me as a long-running fraud. He put it in my box, in my folder, under my mother's ring, so that when his lawyer sent a demand to inspect the contents, it would come out looking like my own hidden confession. What Grant had never grasped, because he had never in his life read a sign that didn't flatter him, was that Riverbend Trust renovated its vault in 2019, and that the entire vault approach corridor and the private viewing rooms are now under continuous camera coverage, and that access to a safe deposit box is logged by keycard and time-stamped, and that a co-signer entering a box alone shows up in that record as plainly as a signature. I did not know it either at first. Harriet knew it. Harriet had done a probate matter at Riverbend 2 years earlier and had sat in one of those viewing rooms and noticed the discreet black domes in the corners of the ceiling, the way people who have practiced law for 40 years notice everything that could someday matter. So we prepared. Through July and into August, we prepared. And I want to describe those weeks, because that was when I learned who stays. Harriet subpoenaed the bank's access logs and the footage the moment Grant's lawyer filed and served me, framing it as a routine request to establish the chain of custody of the very documents Grant intended to use against me. A request so ordinary that Petey Cobb waved it through without a second thought, because it never occurred to either of them that the record would show anything but me. The bank's compliance officer was a soft-spoken man named Emmett Reyes, 54, who had worked at Riverbend for 26 years, and who, when he understood what the footage showed, went very still and very careful, because a bank that had let a co-signer plant a forged document in a customer's box had its own exposure to think about. Emmett is the small kindness I'll never forget, though it wasn't small to him. When I came in to view the footage the first time, alone and dry-eyed and holding myself together with both hands, he stopped in the doorway and said, quietly, so no one else would hear, "Ma'am, my mother went through something like this in 1988, and I want you to know the bank's records don't lie, and neither do the people who keep them." Then he brought me a paper cup of water and left me to it. I have thought about that man 100 times since. He had nothing to gain by saying it. He said it anyway. I also learned who runs, and it hurt in a place I didn't expect. Grant's older brother, David Ingram, the successful one, an engineer down in Charleston who I'd always been fond of, took Grant's side without asking me a single question, because blood is a current, and David let it carry him. But Marcus, weak, shapeless Marcus, the very brother who'd gotten the truck, Marcus came to me in August in the parking lot of the Kroger on Eastern Avenue and stood there twisting his cap in his hands. He told me that he hadn't wanted the truck, that he'd told his mother it wasn't right, that Grant and Ruth had cooked up something ugly about a bank box, and he didn't understand all of it, but he knew it was wrong. He was sorry, he said, and his mother had made his whole life a thing he did because she told him to, and he was tired. He offered to say so. He offered to be a witness. And I stood there in that parking lot with the river smell coming up over the levee, and I understood that loyalty is not a bloodline. It is a decision a person makes when it costs them something. And the man everyone in that family had written off as worthless made it, and the man I'd married did not. I told Marcus to keep his truck and keep his peace and stay out of it, because I didn't need him and I didn't want to make his life harder. But I never forgot that he came. And I've made sure since that he has never wanted for a Thanksgiving invitation. The reckoning happened on the 9th of September in a private viewing room at Riverbend Trust, and it did not happen the way the movies do it, with a courtroom and a gasp. It happened because Grant, in his supreme and unshakable confidence, had insisted through his lawyer on a formal inspection of the safe deposit box before a neutral bank officer, so that the discovery of my hidden fraud would be documented and unassailable. And he had insisted on being present because he could not resist watching me be ruined. And he had asked, absurdly, whether he could bring his mother, and the bank had said 1 additional party each. So the room held 7 of us, Grant and Ruth and Petey Cobb on one side of the long table, Harriet and me on the other. Emmett Reyes at the head, with the box between us and a laptop closed at his elbow. Ruth had worn her good navy suit and a brooch shaped like a moth, which I have never been able to unsee, a small enamel moth pinned over her heart. Grant did not wait. He was contemptuous to the last inch of it. He opened the box himself, with the flourish of a man who has practiced a speech in the shower, and he lifted out the folder and he began to talk before Emmett had finished noting the box number for the record. He talked about a wife who had presented herself as self-made and had, in fact, been siphoning marital funds since 2018. He talked about a promissory note and a loan schedule that would prove years of concealment. He looked at one point directly at me, and he told me, in front of the bank officer, in front of his own mother, with Courtney Delp's name a shadow behind every word, that I had never really been the person I pretended to be, that the whole self-made story was a costume, and that we would all see now what I actually was. Ruth watched him with a small, proud smile and touched the moth on her chest. and I sat with my hands folded on the table and let him build the whole structure, brick by arrogant brick, right up to the top. He never finished the speech. He was reaching for the forged loan schedule, holding it up, saying, "And this document, which anyone can see is in her own file, will show," when Harriet slid a single sheet of paper across the table to Petey Cobb and said in her gravel voice, without hurry, "Before you go on, Mr. Ingram, your wife would like the officer to note 2 entries in the bank's access log." Emmett opened the laptop. The room did not go silent because rooms don't, but a particular kind of stillness came into Grant's face, the stillness of a man who has just heard a sound behind him that shouldn't be there. Emmett turned the screen so all of us could see, and he played the footage plainly, without commentary, the way an honest man reads a verdict. There was the vault corridor. There was the timestamp, the 28th of June. And there was Grant Ingram, alone, letting himself into the private viewing room with his own key and the master. There he sat at that very table, with a folder open in front of him, photographing my documents, one by one. Then Emmett played the second entry, the 6th of July, and there was Grant again, alone again. And this time you could watch him take a single sheet of paper from his own jacket and slide it into my folder under a small velvet box that anyone in that room could identify as holding my mother's ring, and close it and leave. 22 seconds. Emmett had it cued to the frame. Petey Cobb put down his pen very slowly. Ruth's proud small smile did not fall so much as freeze and then curdle, and she said, too loudly, that it proved nothing, that a husband had every right to access his own box. Harriet let that hang for a moment, and then said mildly that a cosigner certainly did. But a cosigner who planted a forged financial instrument in his spouse's file to manufacture evidence of fraud had, in the state of Ohio, committed forgery and tampering with evidence, and the bank's compliance department was already aware. And the forged schedule he was at that moment still holding in his hand was, by its own internal dates, impossible, because it referenced an Ashgrove account number that did not exist until 14 months after the dates typed on the page. She had checked. Of course she had checked. And then, because timing is a mercy you extend or withhold, Harriet laid down the last card, the one I had kept quiet for a year. And she did it gently, almost kindly, for my sake and not for his. She placed on the table a single-page letter from the Cincinnati Hospital Network confirming the sale of Ashgrove Partners and the disbursement to me. And she said the plain sentence, the one I told you to hold. Far from hiding marital money in a company, I had turned $12,000 of my own premarital savings into a legitimate equity payout worth several $1,000,000. I had disclosed it to no one, because I was not obligated to disclose it, and because, frankly, given the company I'd married into, I'd had reason to be careful. She let the number sit on the table, $4 million and change. And she said that I would not be needing any of Grant's, and that the divorce would proceed on the simple facts, and that whether the county prosecutor also proceeded on the forgery was, at this point, largely up to how the Ingram family conducted itself from here. I watched my husband, and I did not enjoy it as much as I had expected to, which is the part nobody warns you about. Grant did not shout, he did not weep, not at first. He sat down, he had been standing to give his speech, and he looked at the frozen frame of himself on the screen, his own face caught in the act, and something behind his eyes simply gave way, the way a floor gives way, all at once and without a sound. He became in that instant a smaller man than I had ever seen him. He had built his whole life on the assumption that no one was watching him closely, and the assumption had just been proven wrong on a laptop in a bank on 2nd Avenue. He said my name once, quietly, Violet, like a question, like he was checking whether I was still there. And I found that I was, and that I was not going anywhere, though not for any reason he would have hoped. Ruth was the one who broke the stillness, and she broke it exactly the way I should have known she would. She turned on her son. She said it was his doing, that she'd told him to be careful, that she'd had nothing to do with any bank box. And she reached up and, I swear this is true, she unpinned the enamel moth from her suit and closed her hand around it as if to hide it. In that gesture, I saw the whole architecture of 30 years, a mother who had spent a lifetime pointing and a son who had spent a lifetime obeying. Now that the pointing had led him off a cliff, she was going to stand at the top and disown the finger. Marcus had been right. She had made his whole life a thing he did because she told him to. She'd made Grant's, too. And when the wolves came, she offered them the sun. That was when I felt the cost of the thing I'd won, and I'll name it plainly because the prompt of my own conscience requires it. I had loved that man for 12 years, and part of me had gone on loving the memory of who he'd been on the window seat with a hammer in his hand, even while I dismantled him. And there is no version of a morning like that one where you walk out clean. I won, and what it cost me was the last soft belief I'd carried since Gallipolis, the one my mother never quite managed to kill with her saying about the chair, which was the belief that the people who are supposed to stand beside you generally will. That belief died in a bank viewing room while an enamel moth vanished into an old woman's fist. I don't miss the marriage. I miss having believed in it. Petey Cobb withdrew from the case within the week and, I heard, from Grant's life entirely. The county prosecutor declined to pursue the forgery in exchange for a stipulation that gave me every advantage the divorce could hold, which I did not need financially and took anyway, on Harriet's insistence, because a boundary without a consequence attached is just a wish. Courtney Delp, when the money story came out and it became clear Grant was not the man of means she'd imagined, and was in fact a man facing possible charges, stopped answering his texts, which surprised no one but Grant. And Ruth Ingram, 81 years old and suddenly abandoned by the son she'd spent her life steering, discovered that a lifetime of treating love like a finite pie leaves you, at the end, with a very small slice indeed. I did not divorce Grant. I want to be exact about that, because it is the strangest thing I did and the thing I'm surest of. I filed, and then I stopped the filing, and I told him that I would consider staying married on terms, and the terms were mine, and they were not negotiable. I laid them out at Harriet's office, with her sitting beside me. The money remained wholly and forever mine, and he signed a postnuptial agreement to that effect. His mother would never again cross the threshold of any home of mine, unannounced or otherwise, until she had made amends I would judge sufficient, which as of this morning, she has not. He would sit in the therapist's office in Huntington every week and do the long, unglamorous work of understanding why a 51-year-old man had let his mother point him at his own wife. And he understood, completely and out loud, that I was staying not because I needed him, but because I chose to, from a position where I could have chosen otherwise with a single phone call, and that the day he forgot that was the day it ended. He agreed to all of it. He has kept all of it for 11 months now, and I watch him keep it, and I have come to see that a man broken open honestly is a different thing than a man merely defeated. He goes to the therapist on Thursdays. He does not raise his voice to me, and he has learned, at last, in his 50s, to say the word no to the woman who raised him, which, I gather, is the hardest thing he has ever done. Harder than the forgery, harder than the speech. Whether I love him again, the way I did on the window seat, I don't know, and I've stopped needing to know by any date. I know that I chose to stay, and that choosing is its own kind of power, cleaner than the money and worth more. So, that is the kitchen, and the coffee, and the man in the 4 Christmases ago sweater. We moved out of Belmont Street last winter. I bought a place up on the ridge above the river, a 1938 stone house with room for the bookcase Grant built and a view of the barges going down toward Huntington in the dark. And I paid for it outright with money that is mine, and Grant's name is on nothing but the mailbox, by permission. This morning, the enamel kettle ticked as it cooled, and I poured the water in 3 thin circles the way Della taught me, and I slid the cup across the table, and my husband thanked me. And he meant it in the small, chastened way he means most things now. I never did get back the $18,000, and I never asked for it. Marcus still has the truck, and every October he drives it up to the ridge and helps me clean the walnut hulls off the yard the way Grant and I used to, our hands going black together. And we don't talk much, and we don't need to. On my kitchen windowsill, where I can see it while the coffee steeps, sits the one thing I carried out of the safe deposit box at Riverbend Trust the day I closed it for good. My mother's wedding ring, a thin, worn band with a chip of a diamond, in the little velvet box that Grant had once slid a forgery beneath. I kept the ring. I gave the man back his marriage on my terms. And what I hold in the end, the only thing worth naming, is the thing Della told me, and I finally believe. The money left the room the day it stopped being a weapon anyone could use against me. But the way I treated people, Emmett with his paper cup of water, Marcus with his cap in his hands, Harriet with her 40 years of patience. All of that is still sitting right there in the chair, and it always will be, and it is the richest thing I own.